Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is a returning guest. David Cook and his wife, Kathleen Cook, were on episode 223 in January of 2020. They talked about service missions. David Cook also wrote chapter 9 of my book, Manifesting Love in Politics is the name of the chapter he wrote. It's part of my book, Listen, Learn, and Love, Improving Latter-day Saint Culture. David is someone I deeply respect, and he won't like me talking about his church bio because we're trying to kind of not do that too much, but I think it's fine that you know he presided over the Chile Santiago South Mission from 2013 to 2016. He's been a stake president. He's been in Area 70. And I believe you live in up somewhere in New York. Which city do you live in, David?
We are just outside of Rochester. We're kind of in between Rochester and Palmyra.
And we're recording this on a beautiful August day. I assume it's green and beautiful outside.
It is.
This is the time of year I wish I lived where you lived. Listeners, we're trying in this podcast to obviously build bridges and bring sort of stories that we don't traditionally hear sometimes in our Latter-day Saint community to listeners. And you listeners are courageous enough to hear these stories. And I love Elder Cook's comment in General Conference, Unity and Diversity. We did a podcast that's released about a month ago from Gene Grant. It's episode 554. He's a active Latter-day Saint in his late 60s who's a Democrat, and sort of talked about why he's a Democrat and why that fits as a Latter-day Saint. It wasn't a podcast to, if you're not a Democrat, to convert you to be a Democrat. It was a podcast to try to build bridges. Since that time, I've had a couple people reach out and to bring forth more stories. And David Cook is one of those individuals that has identified, obviously, as a committed Latter-day Saint and as a Democrat throughout his life. And I thought it would be great to have David come on the podcast. He's in his 60s. He's been on this road for a long time, both as a Latter-day Saint and as a Democrat, and has a long view of this road, and perhaps will help some of you that are liberal or Democrat, or however to use that vocabulary. David may help us and be a Latter-day Saint and just feel you're not alone, and there's principles that apply to you. And perhaps those of you that are conservative and are a different party would just be willing to listen just to see how we can find unity and diversity and common ground. Because to me, Zion isn't that our congregation is an extension of our political party. It's that we have unity even within our political differences, and look at those as actually a good thing to help us accomplish more than if we were all the same. So if that's okay for an introduction, David, I don't know if you want to clarify anything or...
No, that's fine.
I'll just turn it to you to run with it.
Well, I thought, I don't necessarily want this to be about me, but let me kind of start with sort of my own political coming of age, roots, biography, that sort of a thing. And because both, frankly, religion and politics tends to be, to some degree or another, in our DNA. And I grew up in a home where my mom, she was the granddaughter of Orson F. Whitney, member of the 12. Ironically, her parents neither were active in the church at the time she was born, or really for most of their adult lives. They were what was called the lost generation, which was the children of the next generation that were born around the time of statehood and just kind of got pulled into the world a little bit. So on the one side, I've got my mom, and in fact, her name is Helen Mar Whitney, and that's a pretty prevalent name in church history. And my great grandfather, Grandpa Whitney, was asked to give her a name and a blessing because my grandfather wasn't able to do it, wasn't worthy. And so he came to the meeting, and they picked out a name and gave it to him, and he took her up to the front and just decided it was going to be Helen Mar and not what her parents had selected. And so, and she was just a marvelous woman. She was quiet in her own right, but just an amazing writer, and received all kinds of awards published thousands of poems and books, and just really a remarkable, quiet, gentle woman. My dad, on the other hand, he was a convert to the church. He joined the church as a teenager. His mother was from old pioneer stock, and his father was part of the influx of the Gentiles working on the railroad to Ogden. And he was a proud Presbyterian, and so my dad kind of alternated going to the LDS church and the Presbyterian church. He had a brother that was about 9 years older than him, who was also had joined the church. And when it came time for him to go on a mission, when he became of age, the bishop, unlike today where you have a very formalized process, the bishop just knocks on the door and says, "My grandfather, I'd like to talk to you about your son serving a mission." And my grandfather essentially threw the bishop out of the house and said, "No son of mine will ever serve a mission for this church."
Wow.
And so my dad kind of, he was like maybe 10 years old at the time, and he's growing up thinking that's not going to be an option for me. And but 10 years later, the same bishop comes and knocks on the door again, this time perhaps a little bit more trepidation. And I'm just grateful that he had that bravery to come. And he knocks on the door, and my grandpa opens the door, and he says to the bishop, "One of the worst things I ever did was not allow my older son to serve a mission." In the meantime, he was a supervisor at the American Can Company, and he had worked with a number of returned missionaries and was so impressed by him. And so he said, "Absolutely, my son, my dad, Ernest, could serve." And so my dad, never having even thought about it was a possibility, suddenly finds himself in the mission field. And he is called to the Eastern States Mission. He actually served in a couple of places in our state, and certainly in the upstate New York area, and really had a profound experience. He came home from his mission, and the first Sunday home, he met my mother at Mutual, which was in those days not for young kids, but more for adults. And he went home and he said to my grandmother, "I've met the woman I'm going to marry." And a week later, he's in boot camp and for World War II, and he ends up being what they call the LDS group leader for all the LDS soldiers. And in that process, he developed a friendship with U.B. Brown, and they became lifelong friends and corresponded for years. Not too long ago, we found the correspondence. We've actually just recently donated it to BYU. But so U.B. Brown, who was also a very prominent Democrat during that era of the church, was somewhat of a mentor to my father. And so my dad really kind of followed in those footsteps, and he was deeply engaged in the civil rights movement, in the NAACP. He was, I don't know if it was the first, but he was one of the first white members of the NAACP in Ogden.
Wow.
And I remember specifically as a kid, he worked for the federal government, and if you were a government worker and you were a member of the NAACP, you were kind of suspect. This is the McCarthy era. And I can remember him kind of being, his friends coming pulling in our carport. My dad would kind of go out the back in the dark and lay down in the back of his car, and then they'd take him to the meeting place, and he'd sneak in through the back door. And so growing up in our home, it was dinner time was the time to discuss the issues of the day. And, this is the early 60s when I start remembering these things. And so, it's McCarthyism, it's Vietnam War, it's the John Birch Society, which was, pretty prominent at that time. And in my dad's view, religion was our eternal salvation, and politics was our temporal salvation. And he didn't shy away from the good things that politics could do. I remember our Sunday dinners were Dad kind of grilling us in a pleasant way, but grilling us on what we were taught in priesthood and Sunday school. And where he felt that there was, maybe false doctrine or inappropriate things taught, he had no concern to kind of correct those things. And it was kind of a fun time. But there was always, it wasn't blood sport for my dad. And I remember I was probably in about third grade when we did a mock election where they handed out to us the sample ballot for that election that year. And I look at it, and my dad's name is on the ballot for city council. And I went home and I said, "You're running for city council?" And he said, "Well, I'm just kind of filling a spot. I'm not campaigning. The Democrats aren't going to win, and so I'm just doing a favor and filling a spot." But later, he told me a story where it had come to him some information about his opponent that would have destroyed this man, would have destroyed it in the name of, in the eyes of the community and his family. Some really salacious information had come to him. And I said, "So what did you do?" And he said, "Nothing." And I was like, "Why?" I'm thinking, I'm playing Little League at that time. I'm, competitive. And he said, I never forget, we're in the car driving, and he just said, "Some things are more important than winning elections." Wow. And I wasn't going to be party destroying somebody's integrity. Well, that's kind of an attitude that seems to have gone the way of the dodo bird. So, that was kind of my younger years. And then I get to, high school, and my interests were not politics. They were essentially baseball and skating. And I was a very late bloomer. I recently found my old report card, and I think I graduated with about a 1.8. But I did ski 60 times a season usually. I was on the Ogden High School ski team, and just had a great time, wonderful time. I remember the first time I voted, 1976. I was a freshman in college, and I was on my way skiing. And I'd finished my morning classes, and a buddy and I were headed up to Snow Basin to ski, and we stopped to vote at the polling place. And I remember walking into the booth and going, "I don't know anybody that's running." And I'm like, "Well, let's see. Dad's a Democrat. I guess I am." And I just marked the one box and got out of there and went skiing. And I didn't think much about politics really at that point. Well, probably about 6 or 8 months later, I get called on my mission, and I am called to the New York City Spanish-speaking mission. And, in fact, there's a great book I just read called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning. It's about New York City in that 76, 77 timeframe, which was really the low point of New York City on a lot of reasons. And for the first time in my life, and I was Spanish-speaking, so I was in the worst ghettos of the city. And you take a white kid out of Ogden and drop him in the middle of Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn or some of those places, and it's a real wake-up call. But for me, it was such a marvelous experience on just so many levels. And I remember seeing members of the ward, our Spanish units, and they were from all over the country, all over the world. So you learn Spanish dialects from everywhere. But I remember occasionally there'd be an immigration raid on a factory where a bunch of members worked, and you'd go to church, and half the branch is gone, and give them a couple of weeks, and they'd be back. And I just came to see. I had a real negative reaction to people that referred to the poor and immigrants as lazy welfare recipients, because I saw people that were working harder than anybody I know, and people that loved me and brought me in, and took me from a scared kid from northern Utah and helped me through an understanding together. And so my mission really changed my life in just a whole bunch of ways. So I came home from my mission. I rolled back at college. I'm kind of a little more politically aware. I'm at Weber State, and I wake up academically. I ended up graduating with a summa cum laude with a pretty high GPA. And but during that period of time, I think I went through, and I think it's pretty common. I went through what I would call my angry young man phase. Where I was angry at the man, and I just really angry at injustice. And I was hired by Utah Legal Services as a paralegal, doing outreach mainly to the immigrant communities in northern Utah, typically working on fruit farms up in northern Utah. And same thing, I just had marvelous experiences working with people that were just kind of behind in the shadows. I remember as a kid driving up Highway 89, my parents would go buy fruit and can it, and all that time I never saw those laborers. And yet I learned in college, right behind those fruit stands, where they lived and some of the housing problems that they experienced. And so it kind of sort of an additional awakening. And then I worked for the legislature for a period of time. And then there was a competitive internship my senior year. And the way Weber State did it is they would interview those that were interested, and they'd rank you. And then you got the chance to choose between the three internships, which were Jake Garn, Orrin Hatch, and Jim Hansen. And Jake Garn at the time was off doing the space shuttle. Hatch was pretty young and kind of a whippersnapper and well liked, but kind of a firebrand. And Jim Hansen had beat one of my dad's closest friends, Gunn McKay, and I'm like, I can't go to work. I can't do an internship with Hansen. My dad will disown me. But I still remember being at dinner with my parents and my wife and my brother, I think, and his wife, and announcing to them that I accepted an internship in D.C. with Orrin Hatch. And their jaws just dropped open, and my dad just turned at me with complete, he was joking, but with just complete deadpan look, and he said, well, even God lost a third of his children. And but I had a great experience. I had a really marvelous experience. I finished law school, or finished undergraduate, majored in political science with minors in English and Spanish and philosophy, and enrolled at BYU for a joint degree in MPA, in Master's in Public Administration and law degree. And BYU Law School wasn't really necessarily known as a liberal bastion, and but it was interesting. The faculty, when I was there, was fairly liberal as compared to the student body. And during our first semester, there was a group of us that kind of coalesced, that were kind of identified as the sort of the liberal contingent of our class, and we became known as the Fun Bunch, and we just had a ton of fun. And to this day, we're still in contact. They're all faithful members of the church. Almost all of them, are Democrats, and have served as bishops and stake presidents, and a variety of callings, and just wonderful, wonderful people that we supported each other. So we graduate. We come to New York, and I'm still kind of in my angry young man phase to a degree. And I remember one day opening the newspaper, and there had been a small group of people in Forsyth County, Georgia, on Martin Luther King Day, who had engaged in a protest, because Forsyth County it was one of the only counties in the Atlanta area that still was an all-white county. And so this small group from the Southern Poverty Law Center and the King Center had done a civil rights march, and they were attacked, brutally attacked. And it was across the papers all over the country. And I said to Kathleen, I got to go down there. And I got a ticket, and the next weekend I flew to Georgia. And, I'd been in touch with the Southern Poverty Law Center and trying to figure out what to do. And I fly into Atlanta, and I knew they were having a rally. It was called at the West Hunter Baptist Church, which is this iconic black church in Atlanta. And I take a cab there, and I walk in, and it's packed, and it's all Black Americans and maybe, I don't know, a dozen white guys. And I just kind of try to sneak in the back unnoticed, and it was an incredibly moving experience. And so I'm watching some of the icons of the movement, Coretta Scott King and John Lewis and others that were speaking. And as it ended, I stayed there in the back. And John Lewis came walking down the aisle, and he saw me. And I was right on the aisle, and I think he could tell I was feeling a little uncomfortable, maybe a little out of place. And he just looked at me and smiled and said, "Thank you." And then at the end, they said, "Anybody needs a place to stay, come on up. We'll set you up with a family." So I do. I spend the night with his family. The next morning, we drive down to the place where the march is going to start. And the previous week, it was maybe 40 people that showed up for the small march. There were 20,000 people that showed up that Saturday. And I ended up in a car with some real well-known figures, black and white, in the civil rights movement. And we started talking, and there was this one guy in particular who was a Jewish labor organizer from New York City. And we're chatting and just getting to know each other. And he turned to me and he said, "Dave, you're a Mormon, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, and I told him a little bit, just kind of my family background and, how I just felt I needed to be here. And we corresponded for a while. He since has passed away, but he really was an icon. But it was probably the first time being outside of Utah, feeling that the national perception of us as a people, and for good reasons, was not what I had hoped it would be. And so finished that experience, came home. I was pretty engaged politically with the local Democratic Party, worked on a number of campaigns and doing some stuff. And then I started getting a little disenchanted, not with the party, but with some of the people that were vying for political power position. And one night, Kathleen said to me, "So why don't you take a break? Try something else for a while." And we'd actually gone to there's a iconic George Eastman house in Rochester that shows old movies. And we had never seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and they were playing it. So we went down, we watched it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe I should. And then like a week later, there was an article in our local paper about Habitat for Humanity. And they had just gotten started. They built the first house. And I called the president that was mentioned in the article, and I said, "Hey," introduced myself, and said, "Is there anything I can do?" And he said, "What are you doing for lunch?" I said, "I don't have any plans." He said, "Let me come and get you." So he gets me, and we drive around the city. And Rochester had a really challenging history. It was the first city in the United States where race riots broke out. And section of the city burned, terrible housing problems, redlining. Rochester it was progressive in a lot of ways, and there was progressive white liberals that were very involved with civil rights. But when it came time to really engage, the black leadership said, "This is our fight. You need to give us space for our fight." Long story short, I get involved with Habitat, and I don't know, a year, 2 years later, I get elected the president of the board. And wonderful experience. And the day I was elected, the night I was elected president of the board, we had come home from that meeting and the phone rang. And it was the stake president. And he said, "I'd like to come and visit with you and your wife." And I said, "Fine." I had no premonitions, no idea. So he comes over and he sits down and he says, I want to call you to be the bishop of the ward. I was, 30 years old. And I said, "President, I was just elected to this position. What should I do?" And I kind of expected he would say, "Well, you'll need to resign from that. You can't do it all." And he didn't. He said, "No, don't resign. It sends the wrong message to the community and the wrong message to the board. I don't know how you'll do it, but it's going to work out."
Wow.
And we had 2 little kids. I was a young associate in a big law firm with a demanding career and bishop, and somehow they were marvelous years and it worked out. I finished my term as Habitat and with Habitat, and then I planned and I frankly, because of kind of things my dad had said growing up, I didn't whisper a word of politics publicly while I was bishop, not a word. And I was very vigilant about that. And then I got called as stake president, served as stake president for another 10 years. And the only thing I did politically during that period is I helped on a litigation matter for our local congresswoman and a redistricting challenge. And then I was called as an Area 70. The day I was released as an Area 70, 2008, that same congresswoman, literally the day I was released, I don't know how she knew, but she called me and she said, "I understand you're free now." I said, "Yeah, I am." And so she pulled me back in, and I, was pretty involved. And then a year later, we got called as bishop president. And when we came home, I knew kind of that, callings of that nature were in the past, and so I engaged pretty heavily in political game. Ran for town board a couple of times, not with any visions of being able to win, because we live in a very Republican town, but just to give people a voice. And in fact, my best friend who followed me as stake president, he had just been released, and we ran together for the town board.
Wow.
And we both lost, but we had fun doing it. And now politically, I serve as the general counsel for the local county Democratic Committee, which involves ballot access kinds of issues and some litigation. It's been a lot of fun. So that's kind of sort of probably too much on my pedigree, but the advice I would give to young people.
Thanks that was terrific, Dave.
Thank you.
From all of our listeners, that was great. And I love just how you did all this church service and did this political work and managed both of those. It sounds like when you were serving in your church assignments, you weren't political, so to speak, and trying to be neutral that our local leaders are asked to be. I love the story of you being in I think Atlanta for that rally, and just getting on that plane and saying, "I got to be there," and walking to that church, and those couple of experiences in the car, and as that leader walked down the aisle and said, "Thank you for being here." That, for me, those were really touching.
The best thing that came out of that, when I came home, my oldest son, I think, was in he was in kindergarten or first grade. Can't remember which. I think it was kindergarten. And a few weeks later, he brings home from school this little booklet that the class had done about things that they were doing or learning. And on his little page, he writes, he said, in January, we celebrated civil rights. And he said, my dad went to Atlanta to fight for people and their rights. And I'm like, I didn't even know he even figured that out. And to me, it was like, okay, that's worth it.
What a great legacy. That's cool. That's really cool. I follow one of your sons. I think it's your son, Jared. I think he's one of your sons on Twitter. He's got a great Twitter account, and I don't know where he fits into all your sons, but
he's the oldest. He's the smart one, like his mom.
But he does a great job on Twitter and is one of my favorite follows. So anyway, keep talking, Dave.
So, I'd like to, my experience, just to maybe give people some, particularly young people who might be thinking about political engagement. First is do your homework and be informed. Don't walk in to a battle without having the facts, particularly in this day and age when there is so much disinformation. And, I understand the need for civility. That's key. That doesn't change. But civility does not trump truth. And we need to, I think, in today's world, be extraordinarily vigilant on truth. We're in a time I don't think we've ever seen since the Civil War. And it's an awful playbook. And I can tell you, I know the Brethren are very concerned about some of the things that they see. And I don't necessarily get into all of that, but one of the most important things, I think, politically is to avoid extremes. And that to me goes right along with what Joseph Smith taught in Proving Contraries. Truth is made manifest. And be willing and humble enough to buck your own party on issues that you might feel strongly about. And when I say humble, I mean, get out President Benson's talk on humility and read it every once in a while. It's not political at all. I mean, I may have disagreed a lot with some of President Benson's political issues, but that issue is tremendous. But be willing to kind of engage. And one of the best stories I remember that kind of talks about that is kind of a humorous story. And you probably know Oscar McConkie.
Yes, not personally, but yes.
So Oscar Sr., not Oscar Jr., who passed away not too long ago. And I worked with him a fair amount, representing the church on a couple of legal issues. But his father gave this talk. I was going to try, hopefully I can find the quote. He basically said, talking to his children, here it is. He said, sometimes you can't give ground. And he said, you know what? Sometimes the Republicans think God's on their side. And don't concede that ground to them. They don't have the higher ground than anybody else. And so it's important that you don't let that get under your skin. Be willing to endure disapproval with grace and never respond in kind. I was in a Temple Recommend interview once when I was state president, and the person on the other side of the desk at the end of the interview said to me, I understand you're a Democrat. I said, yes. And she said, how can you have a temple recommend to be a Democrat? And I was like, I'm here signing your recommend right now. And it ended up being a good talk. We had a good discussion about it, and it was sincere. It wasn't just kind of trying to dig me. It was sincere question. But also, be faithful as a Latter-day Saint, and don't give anybody excuse to discount you or to presume that you're less committed in the gospel because of your political affiliation. I mean, I can give you a long list of faithful Latter-day Saint Democrats. It's total nonsense to believe that political party has anything to do with faithfulness or righteousness. And realize, even though I think it might be a little bit harder in some places, here it's not an issue at all on the East Coast, but maybe in the Mormon corridor of Utah, Idaho, and Arizona, it might be a little bit more difficult. I think I've had some missionaries. I never talked politics as a mission president. I've had a few missionaries, been, I think, maybe alarmed by a few of my Facebook posts. On most of them, we've had pretty good conversations. But realize you're not alone. And, today, especially in today's world, and be willing to stand up. But when you're serving in the church, you set aside any political differences. And let me tell you a story about that, a couple of stories. The first one was my dad. He had a stake president, as I mentioned, who was somewhat influential in the conversion of my grandfather. And so my dad just admired it. He loved it. And he was a county commissioner in Weaver County. And this is in 1968. Nixon was running. And I think Nixon he paid a visit to the first presidency, as I recall. And so the stake president, in his political role, kind of announced to the High Council that they should tell the members that on their visits that the first presidency was endorsing Richard Nixon as the presidential candidate. Well, my dad, being a good friend with Huey Brown, immediately went home and called Elder Brown and said, you got to put a stop to this. And sure enough, the next morning a press release goes out.
Wow.
And, that kind of gets shut down. But on a personal level, when I was called as bishop, there was a brother in a ward who was extraordinarily conservative. And he'd been affiliated with the John Birch Society, and he was serving in a prominent calling. And I was trying to decide whether I would retain him in that calling as a new bishop or not. And I thought, I viewed him as so extreme politically that it just wouldn't be viable. And so I didn't retain him. And I later really regretted that, because I worked with him in a number of other callings in the ward council. And we never really talked politics. But when the rubber hit the road, when people needed help, he was there, I was there, and our political differences never got in the way of that. And so don't allow those political differences to get in the way of church service. And for young people, let me give you maybe a little history. My great grandfather served as a member of the 12, and he was one of that generation that was kind of wavering in his earlier years. He wanted to be an actor. And this wasn't in the days when you put your papers in and waited for a call. You had a call over the pulpit. And this call over the pulpit came, and he fully intended to take the train out of Salt Lake and change trains in Chicago, go to New York City, and strike out in his desire to be an actor. And somewhere along the line, he had a change of heart, went to the mission. He had a companion that was like, 65 years old. He was 19 or something. And his companion kind of lectured him one day and just said, he was serving as a correspondent to the Salt Lake Herald. And, just really his heart wasn't in it. And his companion kind of hammered him one day and said, look, go big or go home. And that night he had a life-changing dream in which he saw the Savior in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's a powerful, powerful dream. And it changed his life. He stays in his mission. He comes home from his mission and he decides he wants to engage politically. And so he doesn't know what party he should affiliate with. And there was kind of a party alignment going on at that time in Utah between the People's Party and the National Republican Party. And so he ends up becoming a Democrat, registering as a Democrat. And he gives this talk at the Utah State Democratic Convention, and he explains the process of how he made that decision. And he concludes the talk, and he says, I sat down a student, and I rose up a Democrat. And the newspaper reported this. He said he spoke eloquently of the democratic theory of the rights of the common people as opposed to the Republican idea of centralized power in the hands of the upper classes, and said he believed with all his soul that God formed this government for the whole people, not for the favored few. He believed the great fear of the future was the swollen money power, a tyranny worse to be dreaded than a tyrant king. And it was because he believed that the democratic ideas were opposed to that tyranny. That was one of the first things that attracted him to democracy. And so,
wow,
to you young listeners, maybe some of the old ones as well, don't lose your sense of idealism. And the world needs you, and more than any other time. And today, there's some real serious litmus tests going on. And for me, one of them, frankly, is the notion of the stolen election. And I'm frankly quite surprised. The Brethren, I think they walk a very fine line. But if you can read the tea leaves, Elder Oaks talking about the time comes of accepting elections, the things that the First Presidency have said and done and modeled in terms of vaccinations and mask wearing. And what we're seeing is something that I know they're concerned about, of people choosing political views over what the counsel that the Brethren have given them. And, everybody has a free agency. We understand that. But we're at a time where, yes, we respect people, but we don't have to respect ideas. There are certain ideas that don't deserve respect. Racism deserves no respect, period. And, we're at a time where we need young people to be willing to engage in that, and with clarity, with reason, and with love. And I try, but sometimes I let my emotions get the best of me, but I really try. And my wife she calls me down sometimes in some of those engagements. But I'm telling you, we need you. Now, don't allow your perception that maybe there's somebody in your ward or your stake, or and there's certainly people that maybe exercise some ecclesiastical abuse occasionally in the political arena. I think it's frankly rare. and maybe it's just because I've lived away from the Intermountain West for so long, but don't allow that to happen. When you see someone who has stepped over the line, like the brother that spoke a few weeks ago, my heart just ached for him, for some of the experiences that he'd had. And I just felt so bad because I've never had any, and I don't remain silent, but also don't throw your fist in the air and scream and yell. Go to that bishop, go to that leader, go to that home teacher, whoever it might be, and talk to them and reason with them, explain to them, and ultimately you'll be right. But it's got to be done with respect and with calm. Otherwise, you never convince anybody. They get their barriers up and it's over. But stay engaged, stay involved. You'll have experiences. And the other thing is, there's no question that there's some public policy positions that the church has taken that may be different than what a political party has taken. But, I did a lengthy analysis of that once. And if you take all the public pronouncements of the church in the last 40 years, and you put them on the left side or the right side of the ledger, the political ledger, it's pretty even. They've been equal opportunity offenders on politically on a lot of issues. And don't let anybody kid you that it's not the case. And at the same time, know that the brethren, in my experiences, there is not a single member of the 12 that I think would be viewed as a political extremist on any issue. They struggle with the issues just as we do. And if say they're taking a position that is contrary to where you are right now, be patient. And let me just address that a little bit with another example from my dad. The priesthood restriction, that was a big deal when I was a kid, and I was on my mission when the revelation came, and I remember at the time we were teaching a black woman who had a white boyfriend, and I remember writing my dad, and my dad was his letters were just legend in my mission, and I'd read them to other missionaries, and sometimes they'd say, hey, ask your dad this question. And they're just marvelous. And so I asked him this question. I said, we're teaching this woman, she's dating a white man. If they both join the church, can she be sealed to him? And he responded and he said, no. He said, that's the current policy. But then he said, but I have some strong, profound feelings on that topic. He said, I'll share them with you someday when I feel like you're ready. And I was like, come on, I'm on my mission. I'm at my spiritual peak. You should be willing to share. And that was probably a few months before the revelation. The day the revelation came, our ward mission leader called and told us, and I was a really super obedient missionary, kind of a little bit of a Nazi on the obedience side at times. And I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and called Dad.
That's
and
cool.
And he picked up the phone and he was weeping. And I said, is it true? He said, yeah. And then he told me, he said, I had friends, and I could name some names that some of you, particularly in Salt Lake, would probably know. Friends who left the church over this issue. And some of them, I think, experienced the same experience I had. He said, I studied and fasted and prayed over this issue for years. And ultimately, I received one of the most profound personal, spiritual, personal revelations that was, I would see the change in my lifetime. And then it was, peace, be still. Keep this sacred to yourself. And so he did. And so all those years, as he was engaged in the civil rights movement, and he saw, some of the racism issues in Utah that would come up, all the while he knew in his heart it was going to change. And he stayed in the trenches. And that's, to me, a profound example. And we've got issues like that today. And I don't know what the church is going to look like in 10 years, in 15 years, or 20 years. But there may be issues today that trouble you. There certainly are some that trouble me. Most of the issues that trouble me today are cultural. And frankly, that's not a problem. It's not a problem to have angst over a church policy that doesn't necessarily fit right with you, sit well with you. That's part of spiritual maturity. And, believe me, the brethren don't all walk into a room and say, we all agree. They go back and forth and back and forth. And I've had long discussions with some of the senior brethren on these issues. And, the work goes forward, 2 steps forward, a step back. Missionary work is an ongoing, process to kind of hit it right. And they're good men, not perfect, and women, not perfect, that are doing their very best and waiting for certain light and knowledge. And sometimes they're seeking others, sometimes they're waiting. But if you disengage over some of the issues that are pretty prevalent in today's world, you lose the opportunity to have that positive influence. And the church needs you. It doesn't need your tithing. It doesn't need, I'm not saying don't pay tithing. I'm saying the church needs you. It needs your spirit. It needs your engagement. I look back on my 60 plus years, and, I was just such a goofball as a teenager. And I see the experiences I've had now, and I see the hand of the Lord and this golden thread that kind of weaves through it. And I see my mistakes, and I see some of the mentors I've had. I've had phenomenal mentors with my mission president, my father, Marlon Jensen, who I served as a counselor with when he was mission president here, my state president, one of my dearest friends here. And I don't know a single one of them that has faced the church with blinders on. Every one of them is in the trenches and has their own personal spiritual battles and doctrinal battles and policy battles. My best friend and I, we used to do a lot of backpacking together, and we used to play this game called Profit for a Day. And we'd be in the tent, or we'd be in a lean-to up in the Adirondacks. And it never left the lean-to. And it was, what would we do if we were a profit for a day? And we solved a lot of problems. But it was just, within our own little kind of cabal. And yet some of those problems have resolved themselves. And there's always going to be more. And the Lord needs you. Don't walk away. Don't step away from the battle. You are so deeply loved and so deeply needed. So
I'm just so personally deeply touched, David, with your life story, and then you're talking directly to people that are working through complicated issues, and your invitation to stay. I wrote your father's name down in big capital letters on my notepad, Ernest Clayton Cook. And I'm thinking of him in the back seat of his car in Ogden as he went to the NAACP meeting, lying down to be safe, and his courage and his wrestling with that, and the revelation, the personal feeling he got about that is, and peace be still. And then that phone call he had with you during your mission about the priesthood revelation, and what a day that would have been for your dad and many other people, you included. And you had been to the civil rights rallies. You've walked hand in hand with our Black brothers and sisters looking for a better day. And then I look at NAACP people in the front seat of the car meeting, so to speak, with our first presidency and what we're doing as a church with the NAACP, which for someone with the long view like you, and if we could get your dad on the podcast, I'm sure he would talk about, I thought I would never see the day, or maybe he would say, I knew that I would see the day when the NAACP would walk in the front doors figuratively into our church and meet with our senior leaders and would be funding scholarships for NAACP people. And that gives me hope for just continual revelation on the issues that we face today. I believe, like you, and maybe it's partly my own father who's had some interaction with our senior leaders that are good men, that are wrestling with these issues, that are open to new direction. It's complex, and that they deeply care about the issues that our youth and all of us care about. And gives me hope for the future as I continue to follow policy and doctrine today. But I love your invitation just to stay and be part of the journey as we hopefully can do better and make more progress. And I don't think either of us are saying we know exactly what's going to happen, or that whatever issue it is you're looking at, we're going to have a blacks in the priesthood type revelation. But I think we do believe it's an ongoing restoration, and more light and understanding is possible. More thoughts that come to your mind in conclusion, David? And how long has your dad been gone, and how old would he be if he were alive? I'm asking you math questions now to the lawyer.
He'd be 102.
Okay, so he was born in like 1920 then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's been gone close to 30 years now.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now, and this is one of the reasons I have so much admiration for you, Richard, is navigating some of the LGBT challenges as a society and certainly as a church. Maybe I could share a quick story
Please.
On that issue.
Please.
When I was called as bishop, we had a member of the ward who was he was a graduate student, wonderful man. He blonde-haired, blue-eyed. He was in the Army Reserve, been in Iraq. Just a great person. And, I'm not a person that the Lord speaks to in dreams. I get revelation more on my feet or in the books than I do in dreams. But there have been a few of those. And when I was bishop, I had this dream, and of him, and the dream was that he was gay. Wow. And I won't give you the detail of what that was, but and I woke up and I said to my wife, I had a weird dream about a member board, and I didn't tell her who or what. This was just a weird dream, and I kind of blew it off, and that was probably like Tuesday or Wednesday, and Sunday rolls around, and he comes up to me after sacrament meeting and says, "Can we meet?" And I said, "Sure, just hang on. I got some other appointments, but just hang on." So he comes in, the last one, and he sits down, and he just begins to weep, just profoundly weeping. And the dream came to my mind. And I said to him, "I think I know why you're here." And he said, "No, you don't." And he just threw tears. And I said, I think you're here because of concern, challenges relative to your sexual orientation. And this is like 1990. So this is, 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
And he just looked at me and said, I've never told anybody that. And it was the beginning of a marvelous friendship. He is no longer involved with the church. He has a partner. You would know him if I told his name, probably through your ministry. And I reconnected with him about 3 or 4 years ago through Bryce Cook, who had written a paper, and he's one of the vignettes in that paper. So I reconnected with him, and it's been really marvelous. Some years later, he had moved out of our stake. He was in the neighboring stake here in Rochester. And he was asked to come to a disciplinary council. And, this is pretty early on in understanding these kinds of issues. And he had asked me if I would come and speak on his behalf. And I said, I'd be honored to. And I said, I'm just going to tell him who you are and my experience. And so I go in with this high council. And I knew most of the brethren on that high council. Many of them have passed away since then. And I just said, look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I suspect what the outcome is likely to be, but I want you to know who he is and treat him with compassion and love and fellowship regardless of what the outcome might be. And so I told him the story. And what was really interesting is over the preceding, the following, I'd say 10 years, I would run into one of these brethren randomly, sometimes in the temples, some at the Hilcomore pageant, some in town, and probably not all of them, but a good number of them. And a couple of them in the interim had sons who'd come out. One lost a son to suicide.
Wow.
And all of them that approached me said, my heart has really changed since that night.
Wow.
And he said, I remember a lot of the experience that you've had, that you hadn't shared with us. And again, I might speculate in the tent with my buddy of what we might do, but that's not my call. But my call is to love and honor and support. And that's what you're doing so much and admiring so much. And that's a tough issue. And it is going to be, but I'm convinced that over time, there will be, I don't know what will happen. I think over time we'll see some kinds of changes or whatever. And we need to be part of that. We need to be engaged and not walking away because we're offended, because it's hard. I used to have this sort of, I call it a nightmare, but it's really not a nightmare. But I used to think about my ancestors who, for example, I would think about Heber Kimball, who, by the way, lived about 2 miles from where we live right now.
Wow.
And we actually owned his property for a while. And I, he was known among the brother and even among Brigham as having tremendous gifts of the Spirit. And I used to have this dream of, being confronted with him after this life and, him asking me about, the hard battles that I went through. And I'm like, well, I had to deal with being a moderate Democrat, or I had to deal with this issue or that issue, or and I could, and in his dream he kind of like looks at me and goes, "Really? That was your struggle?" that was your battle. And the result of the dream is I kind of get assigned to this, meeting that drones on for time and all eternity. That's just really boring. And so, I think about those progenitors and the challenges that they faced intellectually, spiritually, societally. No reason we can't come through it like they did. And we can't walk away.
I write little notes of things people say in the segments, David, and that was a great segment. But when that good brother asked you to be at his disciplinary council, and they're called membership councils now, the words you use, I'd be honored to be there. And to me, that's just what Christ would do. It's mourn, bear, and comfort, and be with somebody in a really important moment. And then the hearts that were changed as part of that. And then your invitation to all of us, we need to be part of that. So that you, kind of inadvertently, I don't think you went into that membership council saying one of the outcomes, I hope, is that hearts change on this issue. I think you just went there to be a friend to this guy in his moment. Yeah. But I think that's an example of what we can do if we stay, is that our voice and our experiences and talking about LGBTQ, if we have LGBTQ family members, humanizing them, talking about their experience, making them real. I think sometimes we talk about LGBTQ people as this different group of people on a different road that somehow poses a threat. But if we talk about them the way you did, as someone you had priesthood responsibility for, someone God cared enough about to give you a dream, the guy that doesn't get very many dreams, so that you could be there for this guy when he couldn't quite find the words. You were able to open this lifelong friendship now, especially now that you've reconnected. And I think my invitation for all of us is we need to be part of that. And so if you're on the fence about staying or not staying, I think we both hope you can stay. And so you can be a part of that and help change hearts on the various issues that are important to you. So that was a terrific segment, David. It was sort of theoretical, but it was a practical application. I love it.
I honor anybody's journey. It saddens me deeply when people walk away. And but the reality is, there is not faith in and of itself is a journey. There's no easy answers in faith. And you find a faith tradition that doesn't have its skeletons or its hard issues. I mean, every faith tradition has them. And to abandon faith, and some people do it, and like I say, I honor that walk that they choose to take. But there's nothing that, and I'm pretty well read. I know the church history pretty well. Nobody's going to shock me with
a new thing,
with some new, travesty of church history. I'm pretty well up on all of that. But I've read a lot of other religious history, and every faith tradition on the planet has its challenges. Every great religious leader, you can pick Gandhi, Bonhoeffer, Mother Teresa. I mean, every single one of them, even Pope Francis, every single one of them has something in their history that's a challenge, as we all do. That's the human condition. And we ought to get to the point of spiritual maturity where we can accept that humanity in people, because that's where we all are.
I love that. Any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
I'm just probably boring people at this point. So
Our joint prayers, this podcast, to be helpful for you. There may things that I didn't pick up on what David shared that are just hit you in a way that was needed for you. So I think our joint prayers, you'd act on the impressions you feel. And also, this was not a podcast to cause any of you that aren't Democrats to become Democrats. I think you know that. But if you are in a sort of in a conservative ward where there's a minority that are Democrats, that could be opposite, where the majority are Democrats, especially if you're in a leadership position. I think you needed anything you can do just to help people in a minority political party feel like they belong. Their political opinions are valued, authentic, needed, and they shouldn't feel shame for the political party or the opinions they hold. Our leaders have given cover for that. Elder Oaks' talk in particular. I love your shout out to Marlon Jensen. I think I saw a Facebook post of you to dinner, you and your wives together, and I love his ministry and you recognizing his wonderful ministry in our faith. And he has been a tremendous example to me, and I've loved reading and love his voice. So anyway, listeners, this is my friend David Cook and Richard Ostler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.